The first question is, I wonder if you can speak a bit more to Cabral's idea of class suicide. Because when we talk about our responsibility to our students and even to current kind of struggles for social justice, those of us who are in the academy have to first do the work of committing class suicide, so to speak, right? And so I wonder if you could speak a bit more to that and what that might look like in our contemporary moment. Second question is, how do we prevent Cabral, use Cabral's work as a philosophy of revolution and not have it become a cottage industry? Because if we look at the way that Winter's work has been taken up, right, it's a cottage industry, right? People are doing it because it's sexy, it's cool, and I'm noticing there are a lot of works on Cabral. And so how do we keep it from becoming like tourism and more as how do we engage our contemporary material circumstances based on his legacy? The final question is about, I guess, Black Lives Matter. It's very demand-centered. So how do we use Cabral's work to shift from demands to objectives, right? Because Cabral is not demanding anything from the colonial state. He's not demanding recognition. He has a set of clear material objectives as to what liberation is going to look like for the people, right, by the people. And so I think that objectives is not something that is central in current movements or moments, whatever, however you want to think about it. So how can Cabral's work be instructive to that?
I'm reading you right now, page 170, 171, with the class suicide, so you may want to just go ahead and read.
You want to do that?
You might want
This is a strange thing.
and do a Cabral on that real quick.
You know what? I couldn't even begin to try to answer this question without acknowledging that it was Dr. Karenga's work initially, I believe, in Unity, Rhythms of Dr. Sunday.
The African Intellectual and the Problem of Class Suicide.
Yes, yeah. And so it was Dr. Karenga's piece, I believe, 1985, if I'm correct. That really was a discursive point of departure that really helped, I think, me begin to conceptualize class suicide. But in a nutshell, and again, I don't want to, my mentors here, so I don't want to talk out of turn. So I wouldn't pretend to be able to speak for Dr. Karenga, but just the way that I interpret it, and again, I think that he's always encouraged me with a great deal of intellectual independence. The way that I interpreted too was I saw Maulana dropping into an African American context as well, and so I think that for me that's both the the national and the international dimension. We could talk about Coweta dialectics at some point, but I also think that that's going to be a dialectic that's very central to Dr. Karenga's work. But in terms of class suicide, this whole notion that, and again, I think that some of this comes from Frantz Fanon, if I can be honest with you. I think it's definitely connected. I also think that there's some connections to a discourse on colonialism by Césaire, among other people. Obviously, we could go to Black Reconstruction by W.B. Du Bois, 1935. And so this whole notion that no matter what Karl Marx has said about classes, to attempt to impute or to attempt to project a Eurocentric Marxist class structure onto folk of African descent is going to be incredibly problematic. And in fact, I believe we saw this with E. Franklin Frazier's The Black Bourgeoisie. Particularly the last chapter of the book is my favorite chapter. It's called The Make-Believe World of the Black Bourgeoisie. So anyway, this whole notion that even if there is a so-called, the Huxtables or some kind of a black middle class, they're not going to be able to really sort of enjoy the fruit of capitalist vampirism the way a white middle class is. And in some senses, even with the OJs and the Oprah Winfrey with the bag, she wants to look at the bag, Switzerland or Sweden, and they tell her the bag cost $35,000 and here's a $500 bag you should look at, man. She didn't have her makeup on that day.
Yeah.
And so again, even though they achieve some level of status, there's still this whole notion of blackness and the quote-unquote lived experience of the black, I think is still there. So I think that really problematizes and contradicts a lot of what Marx said. And that's why I think that Du Bois' conception of class, which most people don't really engage the Philadelphia Negro the way that they should, but Du Bois actually articulates very distinct classes, and he says that a lot of African American classes at the turn of the 20th century, even though they grew more out of a rural environment, I actually find some of them to be more applicable, that they're still more, I think, relevant to us. So I do think that, obviously, Cabral is absolutely on point. In a sense, Fanon and Cabral have this sort of deep kind of intellectualism that's going on, because they're also talking about the intellectual classes. So even though, on paper, everybody up here is probably thoroughly middle class on paper, I think that some more than others. Our value, I'm joking. I think our views and our values are still very much grounded in a working class
Right.
worldview. I think this is also something that, like, my conscience compelled me to sort of look at the hip hop generation, what I call the hip hop movement, because I think that the movement is going to be much more central than a generation. A generation could just be this sort of thing between 1963 and 1993. But again, working with Dr. Karenga he was the first person, chair of the department, that greenlighted me creating a hip hop studies class. And he asked me some very, very rigorous questions about hip hop, rap music, and hip hop culture, what it was, you know. And when he said, well, what's the point?
Mm-hmm.
What are y'all doing? So when your last part about objectives, though, is something I'd love to, you know, hear. But I mean, so for me, the whole question is, what are we moving away from and what are we moving toward? And so just to circle around to the last question about Black Lives Matter, that's something that the Black Lives, BLM folks that I'm working with in Denver, that's something that I'm really clearly trying to get people to sort of, in a more full-throated fashion, say, because it's not just about, you know, ending police brutality.
Right.
There's some other issues, and there's actually a clearly articulated, a sort of a set of issues. But you're right. I mean, if you look at these things from a Du Bois framework, Du Bois says if you identify problems, we must also search for solutions. And there must be viable solutions to those problems. And I think it's that kind of thing where they really sort of, I mean, it would be great if more Africana studies scholars could actually get more actively involved on the ground. I think a lot of us are. But again, I do think that there's some work. I think that there's some bridge building that could and should go on. So the class suicide part, it doesn't necessarily have so much to do with money, per se, for me, as much as sort of worldview. And I think, again, this goes right back to Fanana talking about the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie within the African context as well. And then, just to finish this up so I can give my dear brother an opportunity, the commercialization of Cabralism, or the commercialization of Cabral studies. If I can be perfectly honest with you, Sister Sharice, I don't know if Cabral works lend itself to that kind of hyper-commercialization. Of course, obviously the gentleman sitting here on the first word, I don't know if his work, Dr. Karenga's work, lends itself to that kind of commercialization. I think people might try, but I think that there's a kind of roughness and realness that Karenga has maintained, that Cabral. And I think that, again, when Brother Milcott talks about the way I interpret Cabral's intellectual honesty, Cabral's modesty, Cabral going out of his way to speak in a language to where not only the people at the UN would understand him, but also the peasants, people without Eurocentric education, because we shouldn't say that they're uneducated, they just might not be educated in the way that white people recognize, right? And so for me, it's going to be very clear here that I think that Cabralism sort of confronts and combats that to a certain extent. But as Brother Milcar said, we're going through something of a Cabral renaissance right now. You know, this same thing happened with Du Bois. We had all these people writing very strange stuff about Du Bois. Some of it more fantastic and just really, it was just out of touch with the black reality. And so I think that's also something that goes on with the evolution of Africana studies, is that more people are going to be taking up so-called black topics, but they're not going to be doing it from our perspective. And I think that epistemologically, methodologically, and this last category, praxeologically speaking, that's going to be real problematic, though. So people can do Eurocentric studies of Cabral, and they have, to be honest with you. But I think looking at Cabral from an Africana studies epistemology is a qualitatively different project.
So I'll jump in and say this first on the cottage industry idea. I think it goes back to things I've been hearing from Brother Maulana, from Brother Malefi. We got to close range. Right here within NCBS, right here among African and Black studies scholars, to do the righteous work. That's right. And we're not going to stop the folks who are just going to have a bandwagon phenomenon and jump on and start churning stuff off that has no real relevance to anything. That's going to happen. But if we're doing our work on the other side and supporting each other, and referencing each other, and dealing with each other, then we're gonna take care of those other folks. On the class suicide, I'm gonna practice a little Cabralian honesty. You pulling punches today. Brother, here, I go right now to page 174. Spilling over into and muddying the conclusions he came to on the question of imperialism and revolution, Cabral's convoluted thoughts surrounding the doubtful emergence of an indigenous bourgeoisie haunts his critical theory of class suicide. And he goes on to link it, as he was, again, gently saying here today, that part of it was kind of the influence of Fanon's theory of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth that had 5 years before come out and had maybe some influence on, but this is so critical because, you know, it was some of Cabral's own that killed him. You know, I had always kind of been, I don't know what I had read, but, you know, I was a Portuguese agent, sent him a letter bomb and all this stuff. And then as I got, you know, started digging deeper and started reading more and then actually going over there and, you know, and talking with some of the folks, recalling that moment, it was deep divisions within Cabral's own movement, PAIGC, that led to his assassinate, to his death. So, you know, there are obviously some folks right there around him that he was even misjudging to the extent to which they, you know, were in struggle with the class domination they were supposed to be fighting and instead collaborating with it. So we've got to, you know, recognize that this is one of the real problematic areas. He says a logical rationale for Cabral's erratic conclusions may be located in the fact that The Weapon of Theory was published 5 years after Fanon's enormously influential Wretched of the Earth. I think he's on track for something, and I think we got to really kind of, you know, recognize the dynamics of where Cabral was seeing and defining how imperialism has penetrated down to the level of our own people and have us doing the work of the enemy itself to ourselves.
Okay, so we have, I'm gonna allow us to go maybe 10 more minutes. I wanna be respectful of the fact that the closing plenary starts at 4 o'clock. So I'm comfortable with going to like 3:55 if everyone else is good with that. So we'll take a couple more questions. Dr. Karenga, please.
I wanted to ask Rabaka, since you know both Kawi critical theory and Brock, could you tell us what are some similarities and differences that you see in it?
This is a doctoral dissertation. I'm joking with my mentor. Yes, some of the similarities would be obviously the emphasis on history and culture. I think the deep and profound grounding in history and culture. I would say that for me, the quintessential commonality would be the emphasis on struggle. See, ultimately, I believe that that emphasis on history and culture leads to a certain kind of, a very distinct conception of struggle. And so for me, I think it's a very sort of struggle-centered grounding, and so on and so forth. And so that definitely would be there. Certainly a concerted critique of racism, colonialism, capitalism, and so on and so forth. Emphasis on Pan-Africanism in all its many forms, to be honest with you. I would say an emphasis as well on cultural revolution and the emphasis on cultural nationalism, right? Again, I think that, well, that at the same time is going to be different, if I can be honest with you, because I think that Cabral, well, again, this is good. When it comes to cultural nationalism, again, obviously Cabral may not necessarily use that term, so I think that that's going to be really